what the mainstream calls a deficit. It's putting more money into your bank account than it's taking out. So the deficit actually increases the money in your bank account. It doesn't reduce it at all, and that applies across the entire society. So a government running a deficit is creating money, not taking it from you, but creating it and putting it in your bank account.
But help us a little bit more to understand that.
Yeah.
Because classically, when we talk about government borrowing, we end up looking and thinking about doing the calculation with debt to GDP ratio and so on.
Yeah.
And the larger when the debt to GDP ratio gets like above 100, because we know institutions like the World Bank and the IMF say the gold standard is about 60% debt to GDP. But here in St. Vincent, we're close, probably 80+% now. And some Caribbean countries, 100 and some, in Antigua, the last time I checked, was 143% of GDP. So help us to understand how government borrowing puts more money into the pockets of people.
Okay, because the government, I'll start with actually if you borrow money as a private person. Okay, if you borrow money from a bank, then the bank, let's say you borrow $1 million, East Caribbean dollars. Okay, they put $1 million in your bank account, which you then spend. Of course, you don't borrow for the pleasure of being in debt. They put $1 million in your account and they say you owe us $1 million. Okay? So you haven't actually gained any net worth out of that. You've now you've gone from having no money to $1 million of money, and that's why you borrow, because you need that to invest and buy land and so on. But you haven't increased your net worth. You've got, as well as having $1 million in cash, you've got $1 million in debt. That's the private situation. And then if you want to make money out of whatever you've done, let's say, for example, you want to build an arrowroot processing factory to make up for what the volcano did in 2020, 2019, wiping out the factory. Then you have to have a turnover of business to do that. And if you don't sell sufficient arrowroot to finance the interest you've got to pay on that $1 million, let's say you're paying 5%, so you've got to pay, we'll say 10%, you've got to pay $100,000 a year. If you can't finance that, ultimately you go bankrupt and the bank takes over your asset. Be wiped out. That's what we think about debt, and that's genuine. That's what the actual situation is. We apply exactly the same thing to a government, but for that to be real for a government would need to be borrowing money from someone else. Now, in fact, the government creates money. The government doesn't need to borrow because it has the authority to create the banknotes we all use in transactions. But equally, if the government spends more than it takes off you in taxation, it puts that money in your bank account, but it doesn't say you now owe us that money. The government, when it creates the money as an asset for you and me, it also creates what are called reserves, but the proper term for them is settlement accounts, reserves for the banks as assets. So if the government runs like, let's say $1 billion, I know it's not this high, but I'll use that figure, $1 billion of deficit, then it puts $1 billion of newly created bank deposit money into our deposit accounts, and it also puts $1 billion worth of reserves into the accounts of the banks in the Caribbean. And that means that we get money without any debt attached. So as individuals, we receive, and companies, we receive money we can spend without any debt liability. So it's freer for us than if we borrow money.